What is the Merenptah Stele, and how does it support the Bible?
Hey everybody, Jordan here for Bible and Archaeology. We got sent this video, and so we want to take a moment to walk through some of the claims they make and give you some more context around this very important and very real artifact, the Merneptah Stele. They call it the Merenptah. You'll hear it pronounced either ways. You might also hear it known as the Israel Victory Stele. You might also hear Stele or Stele. Either case, it depends on your pronunciation. But we're going to walk through their claims, what they have to say, where they mislead you potentially a little bit, and a little bit more that you need to know about this. So let's start back from the beginning and see where they want to go.
What is the Merenptah Stele, and how does it support the Bible?
And we're going to pause here before we get into their unpacking, because you should ask a question immediately when someone starts their explanation with, how does it support the Bible? They are turning to an archaeological artifact with the intention there to see how it supports a specific text. Archaeological objects are difficult when used in this way because that's not really something that they're really good at. Archaeological objects require lots of interpretation, as does the text of the Bible, and certain objects can become these pegs that people want to turn to try to prove or to disprove something, but usually that object by itself can't do that because it comes from a very specific context. It has a historical environment. It might have a literary record that surrounds it that you need to have in order to understand what it does or what it doesn't say. And so while the Merneptah Stele does give us our earliest archaeological attestation to the name Israel, what it doesn't do, and we can say this up front, what it does not do is say anything more than that about that group. It says a lot of stuff about other things like the Libyan War, but it doesn't tell us much about who's understood to be a part of that group, anything about them. We just get that name. So to turn to something like this and say, this is how this is going to prove the Bible, can often lead to readings and interpretations that are detrimental to our understanding of that archaeological object itself, the context that it emerges from, and what it can really tell us about a wide range of things. So again, if you see this framing, maybe immediately have some questions.
Well, Merenptah was a famous pharaoh, the son of Ramses II. He lived in the 1200s BC, which biblically speaking would be the time of the judges.
Yes, he is the son of Ramses II, and yes, he does reign in the late 13th century. The period of his reign is typically seen from around 1213 to 1203. So this is late 13th century, an important period in our understanding of the broader ancient Mediterranean because we are coming closer to this period of late Bronze Age collapse. We're not there yet, but in the late 13th century and into the succeeding eras, Egyptian connection to the land of Canaan, the way they are using their power in that region, starts to change. So Merneptah, both in this stele as well as in the great Karnak inscriptions, speaks about some campaigns and some conquests with some names that show up here like Israel, but in the great Karnak inscriptions, references to the sea peoples. And so you have an indication of some shifting dynamics and a changing world within which Egypt is operating. And so there's a period of withdrawal that is about to start to happen. And when they say here as well, speaking in the time of the judges, this is now moving outside of the chronology established by things like these archaeological objects, things that are within the understanding of Egyptian chronology, and moving into a biblical chronology. And as he says, this is the biblical period of the judges. That is when the Bible would place that if you're turning to a dating from something like 1 Kings 6, that works from a period that it ascribes Solomon building the temple and moves backwards to date the Exodus. Within that context, that is the period of the judges, yes, for the biblical text. Within the context of the Merneptah Stele, it doesn't tell us that this is the period of the judges here. So not a huge quibble there, but a bit of a blending of dating frameworks that are coming into this, again, because they have a concern here to say, how does this prove the Bible? So it shouldn't be a total surprise that they're then turning to a biblical chronology, but when you start to blend those chronologies together, you should, again, ask some questions as to, well, how are you turning towards one or another? Are you asking the same questions about both? What is the way that you're engaging with this? All of these are little underlying questions that you should have.
And a stele is a stone monument, often with an inscription. This was something that Pharaoh erected to commemorate his military campaigns.
It is something that he erected to commemorate his military campaign, very specifically a war with the Libyans. The majority of this inscription, it does both have an image and an inscription. The majority of it is dedicated to his victory against the Libyans. It is not until the very last lines where we get a description of an additional campaign in Canaan and this reference to Israel. They are very, very minimal in the reading of this entire inscription. They're like a footnote that gets tagged on at the end as, yes, this happened as well, but it was not the primary focus of this. I also want to add a little bit about the archaeological history of this object. It was found by Flinders Petrie in 1896, the famed archaeologist, and it was found in the mortuary complex of Merneptah. And as I mentioned before, there's also those great Karnak inscriptions, which are credited to Merneptah as well from the Karnak temple complex. So this is not the only archaeological object that talks about his victories in places that are potentially propagandistic, which is how you should see this type of inscription. Whenever the Egyptians are putting something down in stone, or whenever anyone is really putting something down in stone, you should ask questions of the way they are depicting this, because, as we talked about in a past interview with Brianna Jackson, you can go and check that out for more. The Egyptians loved to use these grand depictions for propagandistic purposes. It was their intention. That is what they were doing with this. So when we see a description here of specific actions, of specific peoples, it doesn't mean that those things didn't take place, but they may not have taken place exactly like it says, or they may not represent exactly who they are saying they represent. So this is something that does commemorate a military campaign, but in a propagandistic way.
And so you can see this Merenptah Stele, a stone monument in the Cairo Museum today. It has a hieroglyph inscription that mentions the name Israel for the first time in the archaeological record. And so
it does mention Israel for the first time. That is why this object is so famous, why it garners so much attention, but also why it can be so misunderstood. Because this becomes the point of fascination that people latch onto, ignoring what else it has to say, and then misunderstanding what it's actually saying or how little it is actually saying about that reference to Israel. So we do get this hieroglyphic reference to Israel, which is marked by the determinative for a people group, and specifically a foreign people group. But within this last section here, it gives us more than just a reference to Israel. It describes his campaign in Canaan and gives us references as well to Ashkelon, to Gezer, and to Yanoam, which are marked by the determinative for a city or a place. So these city-states are also described. I think it's interesting that this doesn't get mentioned because it is grounding very much, in an important way, the reference to these people within a city-state complex that we know from that region. That's an important thing. It is placing them in this land at a specific period of time. However, it is acknowledging that the Egyptians identify somebody, someone, as Israel. But it doesn't say who that is. It doesn't say where they came from, when they came from, how they came to be here, what we understand about them. It is nothing more than the inclusion of that name. So that does matter, yes, but it is limited in how much it can tell us. And so that leads some individuals to over-apply its interpretive value by turning and trying to put it into relationships with things like the biblical texts in ways that it can't really sustain, because it doesn't say too much about who these people are. The Egyptians are great record keepers for who is around them, who is on their borders, who are they conquering. Yes, but they don't always give us these great descriptions of who those people are. What do we know about them? What are their practices? That's not the concern. Because this is a propagandistic record of a military victory, it doesn't care to do that. And so it's not there. That's not necessarily a problem. It's what we would expect. But we should acknowledge that it isn't there. So it is the first reference, yes. But what does it tell us about that people group? Not a lot.
It's clear that the people of Israel were living in the land of Canaan where Pharaoh attacked them around 1209 BC. And clearly, if they were a formidable foe to the Egyptians by that point, then they hadn't just entered the land in a few years prior. They'd been well established there for some time.
I don't think that needs to be the case. It does tell us that there is a people group. There is some group identified as Israel by the Egyptians. Yes, it does tell us that they are in this region. Yes, as indicated by the inclusion of those other cities. All of that is fair. It doesn't have to mean, however, that they are a formidable foe who hadn't just entered the land. I don't exactly know how you come to that conclusion because the Egyptians like to include lists of a wide range of foes conquered in a number of different propagandistic victory memorials. You don't have to be important for them to want to include you as a people that they conquered, because you might be one among a long list of groups that they conquered. We can see this in the Great Karnak inscriptions. We get long lists of groups that are conquered there, some of them with more mysterious identities than others. This doesn't mean that those people don't matter, but they may not be great, significant military rivalries in order for you to be included among the peoples conquered. So they don't have to be a formidable foe just because they are listed. It also doesn't have to mean that they hadn't just entered the land. We don't know when they entered the land. It doesn't tell us when they entered the land. We can do a comparison between their reference as a people and the reference of those other cities, which do have to be well established in order to have built that city. So there is a comparison there which might say those could be seen as more well established compared to this people group. But it doesn't tell us why this people group didn't build cities. So you could have different answers there. But it doesn't tell us if they are brand new, if they've been there for a long time, if they're well established, if they're newly emergent, because we do get those other kinds of references to newly emerging groups like the Sea Peoples that the Egyptians are happy to record having beaten. That doesn't mean that the Sea Peoples had to have been well established in order for the Egyptians to want to record defeating them. They were a new group that the Egyptians pushed away, and they record the victory of that. And so here, this could be a newly emergent group. This could be a group that has been there for a while. It simply doesn't say, again, because it doesn't care to give us that information. That's not the concern of this object. I think before we go, there is one last thing that you need to keep in mind when you are looking at this type of artifact, and that is that it is a propaganda piece. And so it tells us, yes, that Israel is there, but it also tells us that its seed is no more, that Israel is laid waste and its seed is no more. However, that doesn't prove to be the case. So you should ask questions then about some of the other things that it describes, because we want to look at this. We often see it portrayed in this way as the earliest reference. It is. But it also tells us something that proves to not be true. So how do you weigh those things when you turn to an object like this, and when you try to use it to support or to inform other readings? You have to ask some questions of it, because one part of this you may want, and the other part you may look at with skepticism. Fairly, because it's not true, because it's propaganda. They didn't wipe them all out. They were not no more. There were still people there that identified as Israel. But you need to keep that tension in mind when you see conversations like this that bring this type of argument around an object like this, so famous and sometimes such a touchstone, that it's not as simple as how does this prove the Bible? That's not the concern of this artifact. It has a lot that it can tell us, but there's also a lot that it cannot tell us. If you want more on this, we have a number of videos, but two that I would immediately recommend. One is our interview with Dr. J.P. Dessel, where we talk about the late Bronze Age collapse, and he speaks at some depth about the connections between this object and the broader happenings in the region. Another is our interview with Brianna Jackson, talking all about how we should be reading and questioning propaganda in the ancient world. Be sure to like and subscribe, it helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. But for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, until next time.